I was fuming, absolutely livid, especially at my wife. Mary, I'm Jojo Thompson. How did I know she was mad? Well, she was squished up against the car door, trying to get as far away from me as possible. And she had a scowl on her face that could curdle milk. Why was she so mad at me? I reckon she had a good reason. I'd gone and messed up her night. Something fierce. I felt terrible for embarrassing my wife of 10 years and the mother of our 3 kids. I'd pulled a real boneheaded move. So what did I do to embarrass her and ruin her night? I grabbed the wrong key. You see, the McLarens are neighbours. They throw some wild parties. Mary had been itching to get in on the action, and she'd managed to score an invite through a friend of a friend. We'd never been to one of their parties before, but my wife, who I've been married to for a decade, neglected to mention that this party was different. She didn't tell me beforehand that at this party, all the wives were supposed to throw their house keys into a bowl, and then the husbands would blindly pick a key and take the corresponding wife to the master suite for a night of, well, not so innocent fun. As the party was winding down, I suddenly realized what was about to happen, and I freaked out. I've never been so mad at Mary. Before I grabbed her arm and took her into the kitchen, "Did you know this party was going to end like this?" I asked her. She smirked at me. "Yeah. And you didn't think to tell me before we came?" I demanded. "No," she said, "because I knew you wouldn't agree unless you had to. I definitely wouldn't have agreed. And I always have a choice, let and leave." I said, "We can't leave now." Mary protested. "It wouldn't be polite. Plus, it's just for one night. It'll add some excitement to our marriage." "I could do without that kind of excitement, let and leave," I said again, firmly. Mary tried to resist, but I let go of her arm and approached the bowl full of keys. "I wasn't told about this part of the party," I announced loudly to the group gathered around. "The bowl, I'm not sharing my wife with any of you." I searched through the keys until I found the one with the red plastic cover, our house key, and I held it up for everyone to see. I wasn't informed about the rules beforehand, and I don't believe in cheating. My marriage vows mean everything to me. Some people grumbled and gave me angry looks, but I didn't care. I looked at my wife, who was furious and red-faced with embarrassment. "Mary," I said, "you have a choice to make right now. You can come with me and forget this craziness, or you can stay and never come home again. I'm leaving." All eyes turned to my wife, who hesitated for a moment before speaking up. "I'm sorry for my husband's behavior," she said to the group. "I'd love to stay, but I better leave, given the circumstances." And with anger and reluctance, she followed me out to the car. "You're such a selfish jerk," she yelled at me as soon as we were in the car. "How could you embarrass me like that in front of everyone? We'll never get invited back there." "Again embarrass you, Mary?" I retorted. "What about how you embarrassed me by not telling me about your plan to be with someone else tonight?" "Well, you were going to be with another wife, so Weboth would have had fun," she said. "I don't want to be with another." "Woman Mary Izaid, I reserve that for you, and it's unsettling to hear after 10 years of marriage that you want to be with someone else. It would have just been one time, Joe," she said. "Out of all the nights we've spent together, it's just one night with someone else after being a good wife for 10 years. Isn't that reasonable, honestly, Mary?" "It's not," I said. "I can't believe what I'm hearing, but this obviously means a lot to you, doesn't it?" "Yes, Joe, it did," she said. "I've been looking forward to this for weeks. It's my chance to be more than just a wife and mother, to have an adventure, to be admired, and to have some fun with another man for a few hours." I slammed on the brakes and did a U-turn in the street, racing back to the McLaren's house. Mary screamed. When I turned around, "What are you doing, Joe?" she demanded. "If spending a night with another man means that much to you, Mary, then go ahead and do it." I said, "Stop." And in front of their house, it looked like all the other cars were still there. "Looks like you're not too late to join in." I said, "Get out, enjoy your night with some random guy. I hope he satisfies you in ways I can't." Joe, it's just something new and adventure, she said, reaching for the door handle. You're perfect for me, but I can't go in there alone. We both have to participate, each with a new partner. I already said I want no part of it. Mary, I said, I've never cheated on you and I won't until we're not married anymore. What does that mean? She asked, her tone softening. It means exactly what I said, I replied. It's decision time for you, Mary. She hesitated. And I could tell she was thinking hard. Would you pick me up tomorrow morning, Joe? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. From wherever I end up, I'll call and let you know. It would mean a lot to me. Not a chance, I said, my voice cold and hard. I'm sure your new guy will give you a ride. After spending the night with you, you're making it sound so bad, Joe, she said here. Yes, filling with tears. He won't be my lover, just someone I'm having closeness with for one night. I love you, Joe. You're the only man for me. Do you really believe that, Mary? I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. There's no way you could love me and do what you're planning. Let me get this straight. You just want someone new for intimacy, right? You want a new guy to impregnate. That's harsh, Joe, she said, her tears spilling over. I'm on birth control, so I won't get pregnant. It's just one night with someone new. It'll be thrilling. I won't let you ruin this night for me, Joe, she said, her voice firmer now. I just want a little time with someone new. And you're not going to stop me. I'm going through with it. And you need to accept it. Got it tomorrow morning. I'll be back, and I'll make you forget all about this, she said. Her voice filled with false confidence. You'll still want me, Joe. I'll make sure of it. I won't desire you anymore after you've let another man have what I thought was mine alone, I said, my voice filled with pain and betrayal. Now you're being ridiculous, Joe, she said, her voice filled with exasperation. I belong to you, and you'll still want me. I'll make sure of it. Mary, listen to me, I said, my voice filled with urgency. If you go back into that house, we're done. Your one night will cost you your marriage and your family. No, Joe, it won't. She said, her voice filled with false confidence. We're married, and we'll stay that way. We're meant to be together. I love you, and I know you love me. We'll get through this. I promise. You're breaking my heart. Mary, I said, my voice filled with pain. Don't be so dramatic, Joe, she said, her voice filled with annoyance. Think of it as sending me on an adventure. It's an adventure for you, but it's the end for us, I said, my voice filled with finality. She opened the car door and started to step out. I'll see you tomorrow morning, Joe, she said, her voice filled with false confidence. I sadly shook my head, and as soon as she pushed the door to close it, I hit the accelerator and spun away, leaving skid marks for half a block. I glanced at her in the rear view mirror. As I sped down the street, she looked completely shocked, standing there on the curb with her mouth open. She hadn't moved when I turned the corner, and she disappeared from sight. I hoped she would call me right away, admitting she was wrong and asking me to come back for her. But she didn't. Oh, she probably thought I'd be upset for a couple of days, and then she could smooth things over by bringing me to bed. Well, she was completely wrong. My dad always said that if a woman was considering cheating, she'd already mentally crossed that line, and if a married woman was seriously contemplated, she'd already broken her vows. It's okay to admire someone, but if she's plotting how to make it happen, she's already betrayed you as much as a third. Mary had ended our marriage, and it was time to move forward. The real tragedy was our 3 kids, 9-year-old Jenny, 8-year-old Rachel, and 4-year-old Joey. How could I imagine life without them every day? But I couldn't let Mary's actions slide without consequences. The kids were with my mum for the weekend, giving me time to figure out my next steps. I drove around aimlessly. For a while still happened that Mary would call and ask me to come get her, but it became clear that she'd made up her mind. finally decided on a plan and drove home. Just as I pulled into the driveway, my phone rang. I hoped it was Mary asking to come get her, but the caller ID showed it wasn't. I answered anyway. There was loud music and laughter in the background, and a man's voice spoke up. "Hey Joe, it's Mike from the party. You left. Mary gave me your number. She's really excited about tonight and wants you to be a part of it too. You're a lucky guy. Every guy here is hopping. They'll get her key. She keeps saying that. Someone's in for a memorable night. Come back and join us. There are some hot ladies here who are eager to have fun with you. Go to hell, Mike," I said, my voice filled with anger. "And screw everyone else at your party, including my cheating wife, I hope. You all suffer horrible fates." I hung up and went inside it. Took me less than 20 minutes to pack 2 suitcases with enough clothes for a week or two. I grabbed my laptop and shaving kit and loaded everything into the car. I searched for our wedding license and tore it into pieces. Then I smashed my wedding ring with a hammer. It took a few hits to flatten it, but once I did, I placed the pieces on Mary's pillow, locked the door, and drove off into the night. I wanted to find a motel a few miles outside of town, but first I swung by the McLaren's place. Again, some cars had already left the party, and a few people were outside chatting as they paired up for the night. I didn't see Mary, so I figured she'd either left with her new partner or was with Mr. McLaren himself, the motel I found was in the next town over. It didn't look fancy, but it had parking in the back, which would keep my car out of sight if anyone happened to be looking for it. After securing the car, I bought a 6-pack of beer from the convenience store next door and decided to watch some TV. The first 2 beers calmed me down, and as I opened the third one, my phone rang. It was Mary, but since I knew she wasn't calling for me to pick her up, I let it go to voicemail. "Joe, you're being dramatic about this," Mary's voice said in the voicemail. "Mike Wilson told me. What you said to him, I've told you countless times that it's just for one night. I'm just trying something new with one guy, and that doesn't make me a bad person. I promise that even if I'm a little sore, I'll make it up to you. When I get home tomorrow, since you took our house key out of the bowl, they made a new one for me. The guy who got it is named Glenn, and he seems nice. He's married with kids. Just like us, since you're at our house. I went home with him. His wife and her partner for the night are here too, but they're in a different part of the house, far enough away that we won't hear each other when things get heated. You know how loud I can be when we're together," she giggled. "Listen, I know you're upset, but I promise I won't let him do anything we haven't done." I told Glenn we should keep it simple, maybe just some regular stuff. He agreed, especially since it's my first time with someone else. He'll drop me off tomorrow, and I'll make sure to clean up before I come home. No sloppy seconds for you, sweet dreams lover. See you in the morning. I felt like I was going to throw up. I'd never realized that I was married to such a foolish woman. Sure, Mary had always been a bit clueless, but that was part of her charm. Now her cluelessness was on full display, and it had cost her our marriage and maybe her kids. There was no way she could think that ever take her back after letting some guy have her and rubbing it in my face. I was sure that everyone at the party had had a blast at my expense. I was angry, hurt, and embarrassed, and my wife couldn't care less. I knew I should have just ignored her message, but I couldn't. I called her back, and she picked up after the third ring. "Hey, honey, Glenn and I just got comfy in bed, so I can't talk long," she said, her voice filled with false sweetness. "Shut up, Mary," I said, my voice filled with anger. "This might be the last time you hear from me. You don't realize what you've done, but you'll find out soon enough. Enjoy your time with Glenn, because the consequences will be worse than you can imagine. Understand this, Mary. Once Glenn touches Our marriage is done, do you hear me, done? I never thought I'd say it, but I hate you more right now than I ever loved you. I continued, my voice filled with pain and betrayal. I can't wait to be done with you completely. My lawyer will contact you next week. I hung up, and within 30 seconds she called again. I let it go to voicemail. Joe, why are you acting like this? Mary's voice said in the voicemail, sounding like she was about to cry. How could you say those things to me? I'm your wife. Can't you just let me have this one night? Glenn and I just started, and now you're ruining it for me. I don't know if I can enjoy being with him like I want to. Now we're not getting divorced. I'll be home in the morning and we can talk this out. I'd come home now. But I promised Glenn I'd stay with him tonight. Please understand. Honey, I have to do this. He got my key, and I promised him he could have me. He really wants to do that. Now, oh God, please. Oh yes, please try to understand, darling. See you in the morning. I couldn't resist. I called her back, and this time it rang several times before going to voicemail. It was clear that Glenn was with my wife and she was enjoying it. From your last voicemail, I can tell that Glenn is already with you and you're enjoying it, I said, my voice cold and hard. You can spend the night with him, experiencing all the new sensations he's giving you, Mary. But you couldn't keep your promise to me, who's loved you and stayed faithful for over 10 years. I don't even recognize you. Anymore, you won't see me in the morning, and you might never see me again, but you'll receive divorce papers next week, and I'll be charging you with adultery now that Glenn is doing what only I should be allowed to do. You're officially a cheater. You can cheat with any man you want from now on, but I'll definitely keep my promise to never be with you again. Mary didn't return my call. I knew how absorbed she got during intimacy. She entered a world where nothing else mattered except her and the man she was with. I was sure that they were completely focused on each other by now. I finished the rest of the six-pack, and the beer helped. I eventually fell asleep, tears still streaming down my face. I woke up about 4 hours later, and reality hit me hard. My wife had taken a lover, and now I needed to figure out how to protect my kids, get her out of my life, and make everyone at that party as miserable as possible. We lived in a small town in Texas, and I knew that Texas law allowed divorce based on adultery. I could avoid paying alimony and maybe even get custody of my kids. He needed a top-notch lawyer, and I needed one fast. I took a shower and changed clothes at 7:30. I called my mum and filled her in on what had happened. She was just as surprised as I was about Mary's actions. She had the kids for the weekend and assured me that she wouldn't say anything to them. I told her that I'd pick them up. Once I had a plan, I assumed that Mary would likely get custody of the kids, at least. For now, it was hard to admit, but she'd been a good mother and wife up until last night. After I hung up with my mom, I went to the diner nearby for breakfast. As I was parking and heading towards the door, my phone rang. It was Mary. I debated answering, but I decided against it, letting it go to voicemail. She didn't leave a message, though instead she called back immediately, repeating repeated L until she finally left a message. Sobin, Frank, answer the damn phone, talk to me. What do you mean? That I may never see you again? And what's all this talk about divorce papers? You can't leave me. Frank, we have 3 precious kids who need us both. Why did you tear up our marriage license and smash your wedding ring? I gave you that ring on our wedding day, and you promised to wear it forever. It's a symbol of our eternal love. I knew you'd be a bit UPS upset with me, but I never expected you to go this far. Frank, I love you deeply, but I really needed that special night with Glenn. It meant a lot to me. He made me feel alive and young again. I forgot how exhilarating it is to laugh and scream at the same time, but as incredible As last night was, Frank, you're the only man for me. I know how to make it up to you and ease your hurt feelings. Please come home so that I can show you how much I love you and make things right. She started crying again, and it was hard to make out. Her words, Frank, why can't you see? I just needed one night with someone new to feel desired and wanted again. It was just a moment, Frank. Nothing more, please, Frank, talk to me. I love you. You and our kids mean everything to me. Her voice grew weaker, and she continued to sob until the message ended. I stood outside the diner completely stunned. Had Mary been harboring these feelings throughout our entire marriage? And they'd suddenly surfaced in her mid-30s. Mary was still as beautiful as ever, standing. At 5'5", in weighing 130 lib, with dark blonde hair that fell to her shoulders and light blue eyes. She had a fantastic figure, and her breasts were just the right size. Although her hips were a bit wider after having 3 kids, she still turned heads wherever she went. So what was this nonsense about needing to feel desired by another man? I'd always shown her how much I loved and desired her. I'd surprised her with flowers, taken her out on dates at least once a week, and told her every day how beautiful she was and how much I loved her. Our intimacy had been amazing, or so I'd thought. We'd made love at least 3 times a week, and I'd always made sure she'd had 1 or more peaks. I'd lost my appetite, but I went into the diner anyway. I found an empty table and ordered scrambled eggs, toast and black coffee. I barely touched my breakfast, but I drank at least 6 cups of coffee. I'd never felt so lost, empty and devastated in my life. I'd heard people say that they'd wished they were dead, and now I understood what they'd meant. The only thing that was keeping me going was the thought of my children. I had to live for them. I had to navigate through this living nightmare that Mary had created and build a future for them. That thought alone filled me with determination. I would persevere. Mary called my phone about 20 times that day, but I always let it go to voicemail. She pleaded with me to understand, but not once did she apologize for her actions. She never admitted to making a mistake. Instead, she insisted that she'd needed that one night, and it was my responsibility to support her. They'd had intimacy 3 times that night, and once more in the morning. She'd mentioned being worried that she hadn't turned her phone off in time, and I might have overheard them the first time, right? As Glenn had done his job, she'd hoped that I hadn't heard too much. She'd really known how to hurt me deeply. I couldn't believe that she'd been so foolish. However, on the bright side, I now had solid audio evidence of her infidelity to use against her in court, while I wasn't sure if it'd be sufficient. Their recordings were very convincing, and they'd left no room for doubt. I'd planned to find a good lawyer the next day and gather all the necessary information. I'd visited my children at my mum's place. She told me that Mary had already called to check on the kids and ask about my whereabouts. Mum explained that I'd been upset about what had happened and didn't want to see or talk to Mary, apparently married, started crying, saying that I didn't understand. Mum told her that no man understand a wife flawn in an affair in her husband's face. Married asked if she should pick up the kids, but Mum suggested that it might be best for them to stay a few more days until things had calmed down. The kids been happy to see me, but they'd wondered where their mum was. I told them that she'd been busy with something important to her, and they'd be staying with Grandma for a bit longer. We'd played games and had dinner together before I'd hugged and kissed them goodbye and returned to my motel. Tomorrow was going to be a hectic day. Before calling it a night, I'd had one more thing to do, well, more like a quick drive-by. As soon as I'd spotted my house, tears had welled up again. I'd cried for what had been lost. Knowing that it had been gone forever, I'd been surprised to see now familiar cars in the driveway, although there might have been one in the garage. Seeing only the kitchen light on downstairs made me think that Mary'd been alone at least for tonight. Then it had hit me. I'd still had feelings for her. No, I wouldn't take her back after what she'd done, but it had pained me deeply to imagine her betraying me with another man. I'd tried to resist the urge to spy on her, but I'd given in. I'd parked a block away and walked back to peek through the kitchen window. She'd sat at the table, an empty bottle of vodka beside her. Her hair had been messy, and mascara had streaked down her face. She'd worn a robe, and she'd rested her head on the table. Her eyes been closed. It had been clear that she'd been crying, surrounded by a pile of tissues. For a moment I'd felt sorry for her, but then I'd remembered her betrayal and my sympathy vanished. I'd wanted to lash out, but instead I'd walked back to my car and driven off. There'd been a hint of satisfaction, though maybe she'd been starting to realize the gravity of her actions. If she'd wanted pity, she could call her lover Glenn Monday arrive. Dearly, and I'd had a busy agenda at the diner. I'd had eggs toast and coffee, and this time I'd finished everything. After that I'd called my mum and talked to each of my kids, reassuring them of my love and promising to see them soon. Then I contacted work and informed my executive assistant that I'd be healing. Personal matters for the next couple of days. I'd let her know that she could call or text me if anything urgent came up. She'd sensed that something was wrong, but I hadn't elaborated, promising to explain. Later, back during my final year at college, I'd shared an apartment with two good friends. John and Mark. We'd formed a strong bond, and although we didn't see each other, often we'd stayed connected over the years. My major had been in computer science. JN studied business administration and Mark pursued a career in law. I'd called John first and asked if both of them could meet me for drinks around 5. I'd needed their advice on a serious matter, and John agreed to reach out to Mark. We'd arranged to meet at a bar by the beach. I'd arrived early, and shortly after 5, Mark arrived, followed by John. 10 minutes later, we greeted each other warmly and found a table on the patio, ordering drinks and in a toast. "What's going on, Joe?" John asked. "Your call sounded serious." Mary cheated on me and made sure I knew about it. I'd confided, and then I'd proceeded to tell them the whole story. "Dang, that's rough," John exclaimed. "I can't even wrap my head around her doing something like that." "Same here," Mark chimed in. "But she went ahead and did it with no shame or regret, and she still thinks that I'm overreacting," I'd said, shaking my head. "Can you believe that? So what's your plan?" Joe asked, talking a sip of his beer. "I want a divorce, and I want to teach Glenn a lesson, whoever he is, along with the other jerks at the party," I'd replied, my voice filled with determination. "But more than anything, he want to fight for custody of my kids. Getting custody might not be simple," Joe cautioned, "unless she's been a neglectful mother, if she's bringing random guys home and having affairs while the kids are there, then you might have a case. Otherwise, if she's generally a good mum, she'll likely get custody and you'll be on the hook for child support. I can handle that as long as I can still spend time with them whenever I'd replied, and Mark nodded. The courts usually prefer both parents to be involved and in the kids if they're both fit parents. He'd explained, "What about finances, Joe?" John asked Chong in the subject. "Mary stays home with the kids and you're likely making a good 6-figure salary. What's in your accounts? Check-in, savings, investments, 401 kilos, Iris, you've got all of that. And when you add it up, it's probably around 700 or 800 grand, maybe a bit more. The court will likely split that evenly and give Mary the house in custody," Mark added. "But if you can prove that she cheated, which it seems like you've got a good case, you might not have to pay alimony. Do you happen to know a really good divorce lawyer?" I'd asked. And as it had turned out, Mark did. One of the partners at his firm was one of the top family law attorneys in Texas, her name being Lisa, and he'd offered to set up a meeting for me. We'd raised our glasses once more, had a couple more drinks and bid each other good night. Suddenly I'd felt better than I'd had in a while as he'd driven back to my motel. My mind erased with all the tasks ahead. My phone rung, and seeing the caller ID, I'd known that it had been Mary. After a brief hesitation, I'd pulled over to answer. "What's up, Mary?" I'd asked. Getting straight to the point. "What do you think I want, Joe?" She'd replied, her voice filled with false sweetness. "I want my husband back home where he belongs." "Well, unfortunately for you, Mary, your little escapade with Glenn makes it impossible for me to ever come back home again," I'd replied firmly. She'd burst into tears. "Don't say that, Joe, don't you dare." She pleaded it was just stone night away from you after 10 years, and that's not enough for a divorce. Think again. "Mary," I'd said, my voice cold and hard. When a married woman sleeps with someone new, whether it's for a night or a second, it's considered adultery. I warned you countless times, and I meant every word. You've brought this upon yourself. God, please. "Joey, you can't do this to me," she cried, but I'd been unmoved. "You can't do this to our kids," she'd added, but I'd known that I was doing it for them. "You've torn our family apart with your selfishness." "Mary," I'd said, my voice filled with pain and betrayal, "you've shattered our lives into irreparable pieces." "First of all, Mary, you've broken my heart," I'd continued. "You've shown blatant disregard for my feelings, for the man who's loved you unconditionally. Since the day we've met, the man who works tirelessly every day to provide the life you desire for. You and the kids, you've betrayed me to be with a stranger, disregarding the vows we made a decade ago in front of our families, friends, and God. You've pledged your body to me, Mary, and last night you've made it clear that you'll do as you please, regardless of my..." "Please, I never intended for it to come across like that, Joe," she'd said. But I'd known that she'd meant every word. I don't know why, but I didn't realize that I was hurting you. I just wanted to try something new. "I love you, Joe. It wasn't about you." "Mary," I'd replied, my voice filled with disbelief. "It was about you and Glenn, with no regard for me or our children. You felt that you've deserved a special night just for yourself. And in doing so, you've torn our family apart. You've cost yourself your marriage to me and probably damaged your reputation with family and friends. Maybe someday I'll forgive you, but I'll never forget, and I'll make sure that everyone knows what you've done." "No, Joe, please," she cried. "My parents would be devastated. You can't do that to me." "Sorry, Mary, but you should have thought about that before you'd acted," I'd replied. And then I'd hung up. I'd felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I'd stood up for myself and my kids. I'd also felt a sense of relief, knowing that I'd taken the first step towards moving on from this nightmare. The next day I'd met with Lisa, the divorce lawyer that Mark recommended. She'd been direct, and no nonsense was in no time in getting to the heart of the matter. She'd wanted to know why I'd been seeking a divorce and what I'd hoped to achieve from it. I'd explained that I'd expected to divide my assets with Mary, possibly giving her our house in exchange for less cash. I'd also acknowledged that despite filing for adultery when in full custody of my kids was unlikely, however, I'd insisted on having unrestricted access to them and avoiding alimony payments. I'd played the audio evidence that I'd had of Mary's betrayal, where she'd admitted her actions with Glenn repeatedly. Lisa had shaken her head in disbelief, finding it hard to believe that my wife had been so careless as to confess her affair in voicemails that could be used against her in court. "We might need a voice recognition expert to confirm that it's your wife's voice," she'd explained. "But unless we encounter an unreasonable judge, these recordings should be admissible." As evidence, we'd spent the rest of the hour discussing my goals regarding Glenn and the others. At the wife's swapping party, she doubted that we could win any money from them, but she promised to find a way to expose their activities publicly and embarrass them enough to hurt them. I'd told her That be satisfactory for me, I'd paid her a retainer and requested that she served Mary promptly. She'd assured me that it wouldn't take long and promised to inform me beforehand on Tuesday afternoon. I'd picked up my kids from my mum's house and taken them back to Mary's house. When she'd greeted them, she'd hugged and kissed them warmly, and then she'd reached out to me, but I'd stepped back, causing her to tear up and plead with me to stay. I'd explained that I couldn't, but I'd thought that it had been best for the kids to be home with her. I'd planned to pick them up on Friday. For the weekend, Maud seemed to be struggling, and I'd sympathized with her, but she brought this on herself, and her tough time wasn't worse than what I'd been experiencing because of her. On Wednesday, I'd returned to work. I'd known that I couldn't neglect my job. I'd needed it more than ever, not just for the income, but for the mental distraction. If I dwelled too much on the pain and self-pity from Mary's betrayal, I'd feared that I'd lose my sanity, something that I couldn't allow for the sake of my kids. On Thursday, I'd met John and Mark again, this time for dinner at our restaurant near the beach. I'd updated them on my kids in the divorce proceedings, and John had some good news. For me, he'd been looking into ways to protect some of my money, and he'd found a way to do it without risking legal trouble. He'd explained that I could put some of my money into a trust for my kids, which would be considered their property, not mine. That way, the money be protected in the event of a divorce, and my kids could still benefit from it. I'd been grateful for his help and agreed to proceed with his plan together. We brainstormed a simple plan to stir up trouble in the wife-swapping club without risking legal trouble. Mark had a friend who worked as a reporter for a local newspaper, and he believed that if I could provide him with the address of the McLaren's house and the times that the wife-swapping group met, he could uncover the names of some of the participants. Mark suggested that his friend could write an editorial revealing that wife-swapping was more prevalent in our town than people realized, by hinting at certain business owners' involvement without explicitly naming them, and getting photos of couples entering and leaving the meetings. We could create enough controversy to cause problems for the group. I'd shared the limited information that I'd had with Mark, and he'd agreed to start investigating with that plan in motion. We'd set our goodbyes until the next time. My weekend with the kids been fantastic. We'd gone shopping for new clothes, watched a movie at a theatre, and spent a whole day at the beach swimming and playing frisbee. My children been my top priority, and I've promised myself that I'd always be there for them, no matter what. Monday morning, Mark called me with some exciting news. His friend, the reporter, liked the story idea, and he'd been figuring out how to get photos of the couples entering and leaving the McLaren's house. Even if their face been blurred, people could catch on quickly. In a small town like ours, if everything went smoothly, the article could make the headlines. By the end of the week, I'd kept my fingers crossed, hoping that our plan would work and that the wife-swapping group would get the attention that they deserved. On Wednesday, my lawyer informed me that Mary had been served with the divorce papers at our house on Friday morning. Then John called me with more good news. He'd found a way to protect about a third of my money by putting it into a trust for my kids, and he'd already started the process. Finally, Mark called me to tell me that his friend, he discovered that the wife swap and couples to be meeting again at the McLaren's house on Friday night. He'd planned to take out across the street in an unmarked van, talking photos of everyone who'd entered and left the house. He'd also wanted to interview me again about the party, and I'd agreed to meet him on Saturday if everything went smoothly. The article could be published in the next week's edition of the newspaper, causing a stir in our small town. I'd felt a lot better than I'd had in a while, knowing that I'd taken steps to protect myself and my kids and to expose the wife-swapping group. Frid arrived, and I'd waited for the expected call from Mary after she'd gotten the divorce papers. True to my expectations, it had come at 2:30. My lawyer had phoned to tell me that she'd been served, and not long after my phone rung again. Seeing the caller ID, I'd known it was Mary. I chuckled to myself, wondering what she'd wanted initially. I'd considered letting it go to voicemail, but I changed my mind. "Hey, Mary, what's going on?" I'd answered. "What on earth did you do, Joe?" "Her?" Tong had been far from friendly. I filed for divorce, just like I said I would. I'd replied, "And I told you there wouldn't be a divorce." "And you filed for adultery?" She'd said, her voice risen with each word. "Spending one night with another man isn't adultery?" "Joe, I have to disagree with you there, Mary," I'd said, my voice calm and steady. According to Texas law, having intimacy with someone other than your spouse is considered adultery, and Glennie Tilly had it with you. Tears had welled up in her eyes, and she'd started to cry. "Why are you being so cruel?" "Joe," she'd asked, her voice breaking, "I love you all. Glenn did was have intimacy with me a few times." "It was just a fling. My mistake, Mary," I'd said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I must have misunderstood. That having intimacy outside of marriage isn't adultery. How could I have gotten that wrong? "Let it go. Joe, it's done," she'd said, her voice pleading. "I warned you countless times and pleaded with you not to do it, but you did it anyway," I'd replied, my voice growing colder with each word. "Now you have to face the consequences, and soon enough you'll realize that your troubles aren't over yet. Goodbye." "Mary," I'd said, my voice filled with finality, "have a miserable life," and I'd hung up. The toughest part was that I'd still had feelings for Mary. Maybe I always would, but I couldn't trust her anymore, and I couldn't stay married to someone who cheated. I'd known that I shouldn't go to the McLaren's house on Friday night, but I couldn't resist driving by once to see what was going on. I'd also wanted to check if Mary's car was there, even though I doubted she'd attend the party. This time, her car hadn't been there, but she could have gone with someone else. They'd usually only allowed couples, but they'd made an exception for her once, so who's to say they wouldn't do it again? I'd spotted a van parked across the street, likely where the reporter was. I'd wished him luck in exposing them. Results come quickly. The next afternoon, Mark's reporter, Friendy, called asking for some insider information, which I'd gladly provided. He'd mentioned that he'd taken over 100 photos and recognized over a dozen prominent couples from the city. Oddly, they hadn't been the same couples seen leave in the residence 2 hours later. Mark'd given him a photo of my wife, and he'd confirmed that she hadn't been among those entering or leaving the McLaren's house. He'd wanted me to describe what I'd seen and experienced when I'd been inside the home door. And one of the key parties, I'd done my best to explain how the key been placed into a bowl, even though I'd never witnessed the park where men picked a key and they left with the woman it had belonged to. I'd gotten a good idea of what had happened from my wife's description, and overhearing other couples' conversations about past parties. Before we'd ended the call, he'd asked if he could hint that he'd known of a marriage that had ended because of the parties leaving kids to deal with their parents. Divorce. I'd said he could, as long as no names were mentioned. The article would come out in the Sunday edition of the paper, causing quite a stir. It had been front-page news with a large photo of couples entering and leaving, their faces blurred. The story continued for 4 more pages with many additional photos. Despite efforts to hide faces, it had been easy to identify participants from their cars and clothes, as they'd been prominent members of our small-town society. By Monday, the story had been the talk of the town. Several ministers been interviewed about the decline in morality, and civic leaders condemned the situation. Lawsuits been filed, but nothing had come of them. Some businesses lost customers, and many couples ended up in divorce court. To me, it had all been Amazon a fit, and payback for the pain I'd endured from loss in my wife and family. Even if people realized that I'd been cheated on, I hadn't cared. I'd had my revenge, and that was all that had mattered. Married kept trying to win me back for months, but I'd been firm in my decision. The divorce had gone through, and I'd gotten joint custody of our kids. We'd split the time with them when I'd have them for the month. Mary get them on weekends and vice versa. It hadn't been ideal, but we'd been managing since Mary hadn't contested anything in the divorce. I decided not to share their recordings of her, confess in her affair with her family or friends. As for the couples involved in the key parties, some ended up divorcing and leaving town, maybe because of the scandal. Married, started dating again, though I hadn't been sure she'd fully understood why her actions had hurt me so much. But that had been her problem now, and I'd wished her future husband luck. I'd gone on dates with a few nice women, but I hadn't found the right one to settle down with yet. Some suggested moving in together, but I'd still been cautious about giving a woman a key. Tow me place. It had been a tough year, but I'd come out stronger on the other side. I'd learned a lot about myself and what I'd wanted in a partner. I'd also learned that I'd been capable of hling anything that life threw at me, as long as I'd had my kids by my side. I'd known that I'd never forget what Mary done, but I'd also known that I'd had to move on with my life. I couldn't let her actions define me or hold me back from finding happiness. Again, as I'd sat on the beach watching my kids play in the sand, I'd felt a sense of peace wash over me. I'd known that everything would be okay as long as I'd had my family and friends by my side. I'd taken a deep breath of the salty air and smiled, knowing that the future was bright and full of possibilities. I'd been ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that I'd come out stronger on the other side. And who knows, maybe someday I'd find a woman who'd love me and my kids unconditionally. A woman who'd never betray me or our family. But until then, I'd been content with my life and the love that surrounded me. I'd looked out at the horizon, watching the sun slowly sink into the ocean, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. It had been a beautiful sight, and I'd felt grateful for the simple things in life as the sun disappeared below the horizon. I'd gathered my kids and headed back to the car, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. I'd known that I'd been a survivor, and nothing could break me, not even a cheating wife I'd started. The car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading towards a future that was uncertain but full of hope. I'd known that I'd had everything I'd needed to be happy, and that was enough. For me, as I'd driven down the highway, I'd caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. I'd looked older, wiser, and stronger than I'd ever been before. I'd smiled at myself, knowing that I'd been ready for whatever life had in store for me. And with that thought, I turned up the radio, and sang along to the music, letting the wind blow through my hair and the worries of the past fade away into the night. I'd been free, and nothing could hold me back anymore. Thank you for watching. Until next time.